welcome to Literary Prospects, where we talk to authors and literary professionals about books, publishing, and the writing life. I'm Kelley Vick. I'm the host of the program, and in just a moment, it will be my pleasure to introduce today's guest. But first, a reminder that if you like what you hear, please do take a moment to subscribe. It helps us out, and you can make sure you never miss an episode. Also, we've opened a Literary Prospects shop, so if you're looking for bookish shirts, totes, and gifts, please check that out at literaryprospects.etsy.com. And to grab books featured on the podcast and check out more curated book lists, you can visit the Literary Prospects bookstore on bookshop.org. We'll leave all those links below in the show notes. And now, let's introduce today's guest. Monica Hay is a writing coach who specializes in helping writers overcome resistance like procrastination and perfectionism. She has her master's in publishing, has worked for 2 different literary agencies, and was the director's assistant for Write On Con, an online children's writers conference. Monica's passion for working with writers led her to hosting the Overcome Writers Resistance Bootcamp, a 5-day online course to help writers overcome resistance so they can finally write their book. She's an advocate for neurodiversity and calls herself unapologetically woo-woo. Monica, hey, thank you so much for joining on the podcast today. I am really excited to talk with you because you are a writing coach that specializes in helping writers overcome resistance. And I know that strikes a chord with me. I'm sure it will with a lot of our listeners. So let's go ahead and dive in. You're called the resistance coach.
Yes.
What does that mean exactly?
Yeah. So a lot of other writing coaches focus on craft. So, for example, you write pages, you send it to your coach, and they give you feedback. I do not work like that whatsoever. And the reason for that is because I'm trying to get people who are struggling to even get themselves to write. And a lot of times when you're in that place, you got to write a messy draft or try to write something messy, and you're not in a feedback stage. A lot of people who come to me aren't in a feedback stage. So what I help people do is realize like resistance is brain science. Resistance lives in your body and has nothing to do with a personal or moral failing. I think a lot of writers who struggle with resistance are very embarrassed by it because you'll see like, people who are like, oh, I'm just so lazy. I don't show up to write when I should, or I go scroll on TikTok, or like I have all these writer friends who they don't have any problems writing and I do. Like, what's wrong with me? And it's had nothing to do with a personal or moral failing. Laziness actually isn't a thing when you look at brain science and the body. It doesn't even exist. It's just something that we've labeled humans as in the modern day. And in truth, like, I just want to help people realize that there's no shame and resistance is totally normal.
So how do we define resistance? When you're saying resistance, how do you define it?
I think of it as anything that gets us to stop writing or not show up. So for example, the most common I hear are procrastination and perfectionism, right? Those are the most common ones. There's also writer's block, like when you're stuck on a project. There's also imposter syndrome that comes up a lot. I feel like there's just a lot of different ways that people will discuss it or describe it. And the most common is just like, oh, I just can't get myself to write because when I sit down to write, my brain doesn't want to work. Like I just want to run away. That's what I would kind of describe as resistance. Like just, I can't get myself to write and I'm procrastinating and I'm not showing up and what's wrong with me?
So how did you get into doing this work?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Yeah, so I did not start out this way. This is a really long story, I feel like, but I'll try to keep it short. Essentially, when I was in college, so I was interested in becoming a therapist for a long time. And then I went to social work and didn't really want to do therapy anymore after that. But I still wanted to help people. I didn't want to just be a writer. And I got my master's in publishing. And I had so much fun doing that. However, I really wanted to work with writers. And over the last like couple years, I was trying to find my way into it. And so I started becoming a writing coach and I kind of specialize with like people who are ADHDers. So I was diagnosed in 2021, as a lot of women seem to be diagnosed like much later in life.
Yeah.
And so I kind of did that for a minute. And then honestly, like what got me into this work is going to sound ridiculous. I'm quite a spiritual person. But back in 2022, I went on this trip with my husband to Europe.
Mm.
And I fell down the stairs in Norway and I got really
Wow.
hurt. And it was like not ideal because we were on vacation. We had another like week and a half of this vacation.
Oh, wow.
And so like I couldn't really walk. Like I was kind of just like in a wheelchair, unable to walk. And I was just like in pain and my foot was really hurting. And like I should have gone to the doctor, but I was just like, it'll be fine. I'll wake up tomorrow and it'll be fine. It wasn't fine. And so I started reading this book called Writing on Both Sides of the Brain. And that's a
Mm.
bit of an older book. It's from the 80s.
Mhm.
And reading that book inspired me to do a class on procrastination perfectionism and how to overcome some of those things that stop us from writing. And then that led me into this work. That book led me into this work, which is very interesting. When I look back at it, I'm like, wow, like that book has changed my life. And I always say the story about falling because like I was on vacation and I had like, or not ordered, I think I had borrowed it from my library on Kindle.
Mhm.
And I probably would have just like let that hold lapse and been like, I'll just read it later. And like, but I was so bored. I was just like, I'll just read this book. It's on my Kindle. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is what I need to be doing with my life. Because I've also really struggled with resistance. And I used to feel really embarrassed. I think a lot of people do. Like they don't want to admit it. Like, for example, you'll tell your friend, like, oh yeah, I have been writing and like it's been a really long time. And they're like, well, you just got to sit down and do it. Or like, why are you calling yourself a writer if you're not doing it?
I was
Right?
gonna
Like,
say, there's that whole feeling too of like, am I a writer if the words aren't just pouring out of me because I can't stop them, right?
yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really common. And it's this that messaging is everywhere. Like whenever I do ads, this is gonna sound awful, but whenever I do ads, if I target all genders of all ages, a lot of men will come at me in the comments and say things like, just sit down and do it and stop making excuses and all these different things. And it's fascinating because like the reality is that most people don't realize that it's a brain science thing, right? Like we know that when we go to the gym, for example, it's going to be hard for the first 2 weeks. Our bodies are going to be exhausted. We're going to be sore. It's the
Mhm.
same thing with writing, but we don't realize that. We're not taught that in
So
school.
what is the brain science behind it? Can you give like an
Overview.
overview in layman's terms?
Yes. So I'll try to make it brief. It's a long topic, but
Yeah.
essentially we have two different types. Like our nervous system is constantly active, right? We have
Mhm.
the sympathetic nervous system, which is when we're on a stress response. So anxiety, stress, when we're activated. And
Mhm.
then we have the parasympathetic nervous system, which is when we're on a lower response. So for example, like sometimes we feel depressed or fatigued or tired when we're in that response. And these systems are constant in our bodies.
Mhm.
And what ends up happening is that when we show up to write, and it's been a really long time since we've written, these get triggered. So writing basically feels like a threat for most of us,
Mhm.
unless it's something we've been doing and are used to and have made a habit out of. Okay. So for example, let's say like you don't show up for 6 months because something happened in life, you're busy, and then you come back to your writing after 6 months and you like don't remember anything about your book and you're like, what was I doing? How do
Mhm.
I remember this? So sometimes what happens is our bodies get triggered and your body is like, this is a threat because you're facing an uncomfortable situation, right?
Right.
It's the same with like, whether like you get a mean comment online and your body has a reaction to it. Even though you are technically safe, physically safe, your body still has a reaction to that. So your body has the same reaction when it comes to writing. So a lot of this comes from the person's like feelings about it. So for example, if you show up to write and it's not going well and you've wanted to be a writer your whole life, you start beating yourself up and thinking like,
Mhm.
oh my God, what's wrong with me? Like, I'm supposed to love writing. Why am I struggling so much? And that makes it worse. It makes the trigger worse and then makes your body go into more of a threat response, right?
Mhm.
So our body basically goes into fight, flight, fawn, or freeze when we try to write, and it's been a long time. And that's what I teach people to overcome mainly is realizing the brain science around it
Mhm.
and realizing how to make the brain get out of threat, let's run.
So how do we start to do that when you are first taking on a new client? How does it work? And what are some of the first things? What do you do?
Yeah, what do you do? So ultimately, it comes to the body. So a lot of times trauma lives in our bodies. And when I say trauma, I mean trauma in a very general sense. So I think there's a lot of misconceptions about trauma in the world. We think of trauma as these like big like traumatic events like war, for example. However, trauma is basically anything for that happens to your brain too quickly or anything that's too much for your brain too quickly. And I get that definition from Britt Frank from the book On Being Stuck.
Mm.
And she talks about how our bodies react in that book. And I highly recommend that book for anybody who wants to learn about like the body's reactions to different things in life.
Hmm.
But essentially, it goes back to the body. So there are like physical things that you can do, for example, when your body goes into a freak out and threat. So I always say when you're stuck in up mode, right? Like SNS, so you're feeling like stressed, you're sweating, your palms are sweating, right? Something like that. Remind yourself that this is a body sensation. This is just a sensation from your body. It's kind of like the mindfulness, right? It's like, oh, I'm having a body response and I don't really have any control over this. Like it's an automatic body response. Yes, there are like, there's Wim Hof who's like trained his nervous system through ice baths for over decades. You can
Yeah.
eventually like learn to control some of these responses, but the average person does not have control over them.
Mm.
And I always say when you're in SNS, really use senses. So if you meditate, for example, sometimes they'll guide you into like, notice what you can hear or smell, for example, or whatever that is. Senses are very helpful for the body because it grounds you. I also say push hard against a door 3 times because that just reminds your body like, oh, I'm not being attacked by a cheetah right now, right? You want to
Wow.
basically tell your body that you're safe. That's it. That's like the ultimate thing when it comes to being in SNS mode or up mode. If you're in a fatigue state or in down mode, it looks a bit different. So for example, I say like get cold, which is hard for a lot of people. Like splash some water on your face. That's why cold showers are quite helpful if you're in a fatigue state or you're exhausted. I personally don't do them very often, but they can be very helpful. There's also a lot of evidence that suggests singing helps a lot here.
Wow.
Social connection. That's one of the reasons when people have like depression, you know, therapists will recommend like making friends. That really helps when you're in like a down state. And there's also some funny ones like sucking on a lemon can get your brain out of a down state. Like these like very simple body things. It's really all about the body.
Wow. Okay. I need to go buy a bunch of lemons. You say that you are unapologetically woo-woo, as well as believing
Yes.
in the science. So, can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. So I am very witchy. And I kind of say that like I say that very generally, but essentially I'm very into like manifestation, law of attraction. And like when I talk about, my experience in a couple years ago falling, like I'm very grateful that I got hurt and I fell and I was forced to slow down because it led me to doing what I do now. And it led me to reading that book that inspired me to help a lot of people with their resistance. And it makes it so that I can watch people who have been beating themselves up for, a decade, not writing and finally writing again. But I'm just very into like being a co-creator of my life, right? I constantly talk about my spirit guides and the universe. And like some people find that really weird, but it's just me. It's worked for me for a long time and I've manifested a lot of really amazing stuff. Like literally a month ago, I moved to Amsterdam from the US. So
Wow.
lots of cool things have happened in my life and I'm really grateful for it. I would say the woo-woo part, I don't teach as much in my workshops, but if I have a private client who like is really into it, we go really deep with that.
Mm. Let's talk about the move for a minute.
Okay.
How has that affected, well, your coaching And also your writing life, because I'm assuming if you've gone from the US, that you probably have a lot of clients that are in US time
Yes.
zones. So
Yeah.
how does that work? A lot of
It's
retraining the brain?
so it's been very easy, honestly, which sounds kind of ridiculous. I did move to Amsterdam, right? And I didn't move to somewhere that's super different. Like I am still in a Western country, right? And things are pretty similar here when it comes to like culture. Like it's not culturally super different. And people do speak English here. I mean, I do plan to learn Dutch, but I haven't like really encountered anything too crazy. I think the main issue has honestly just been that I was so busy, for the last 2 months getting ready to move that I was not writing at all. And like I know that all of my what I call writing neurons have like skedaddled. When I talk about writing neurons, I basically mean that to train a brain to do something, it takes 3 weeks, a little bit longer to train your brain to do something. And those neurons just go away if you don't use them. And so like it's just been a minute since I've written. I mean, I think I show up here and there, but not as consistently as I used to. But yeah, most of my clients in the US, but I'm also a night owl. So I don't mind, working till 9 or 10 at night and, getting up at 10, 11 in the morning. Like that's very normal for me. So it hasn't really changed much. It's been actually really nice to have quiet days.
Yeah.
Quieter days with like more busy evenings. It's pretty much the typical situation now.
So you've gotten yourself in the situation that you need to be in where you run best.
Yes.
I want to go back to what you were just saying about taking 3 weeks to train
Yeah.
your brain neurons to do the thing, to do the writing or whatever it is that you might want to be doing. But of course, we're talking about writing. Um, what does that look like? Do you mean like if you sit down in the same spot every day for 3 weeks, it's
Yeah.
gonna come? I mean, yeah, what does that look like?
Yeah. So the first thing I have my clients do when they come to me, if they haven't been writing a long time, is train.
Mm,
And this looks the same exact way that you would tell an athlete to train. You have to start relatively slow and build from there. So when you think about creating habits, right? We want to go to the path of least resistance because the brain is very fickle and doesn't want to take a lot of energy, right?
mm,
And the reason for that is just because our brains are designed to survive. They're designed to conserve energy when needed. And so when you're telling your brain, like, I want to sit down and write for 3 hours a day this year, all year, that's just like the most awful way to make a habit. It's not going to work. You're just going to not do it. And then you're going to feel like shit about yourself, right?
yeah.
So I always tell people to start with a bare minimum goal. And when I say bare minimum, I mean like it could be a minute, it could be 5 minutes, 10 minutes, but start with a habit that feels very easy. So like sometimes I have people say, oh, like 5 minutes isn't enough. Like I'm not gonna be able to write my book in five minutes a day. And I'm like, okay, yes, it doesn't feel sexy to say I want to write 5 minutes a day for a year. It doesn't feel sexy at all.
Mhm.
But what ends up happening is that you show up for 5 minutes for a few weeks, and then you up it to 10 minutes, then maybe 20 minutes, and then longer. And you're literally just building a habit. And what happens a lot, I think, in with writers is that they don't realize they have to train the brain. And so when they start showing up for these small increments and they're like, oh, like this is really hard, they start like internalizing it and feeling a lot of shame. It's just the same with like going to the gym, right? You have to train your
Mm.
brain. So I tell people bare minimum and build from there. And you don't have to show up at the same time every day and the same place. Like, yes, those can be helpful pieces for brain science. Like,
Mhm.
you can train your brain to like notice a certain smell and it'll like get you to want to write. Like, those things happen, but those aren't as important as just showing up consistently to build the neurons. The neurons will show up after you've shown up for at least 3 weeks. And sometimes it takes some people longer. For me, it takes about a month to build neurons. It just depends on
Mhm.
the person.
That's so interesting. I love that idea of really thinking about it like going to the gym and actually doing training and getting
Hmm.
that, writing muscle.
Yeah, because
going.
it is a muscle. And I think it's like the same as if you're learning a new language, right? Like if you don't use it, you lose it. And then you're like, oh, I need to like, look at my French again and remember what to say. Because if you don't use it for a year, you're going to forget everything, right? It's the same exact thing with writing. And it's funny because I always talk about NaNoWriMo within my programs. And like, I'll be like, a lot of people come to me and they're like, I thought NaNoWriMo was going to fix my problems. And then I would like, write my book and I would sit down and finally get it done in a month. And then like after 4 days, I like crash and burn. I'm like, yeah, because what you do is you're going from, that would be like not running for years and then trying to run a 10-mile marathon.
Yeah.
That's exactly what you're doing to your brain in that situation.
So yeah, your brain is going to rebel. That makes sense.
Yes.
You also use visualization tools.
Yeah. So I'd like to talk about what is your ideal writing life. And this is something I love doing because like I'm a daydreamer. I mean, I can't help it. And I just like to imagine what my dream life would be. I mean, that's like what I did before I moved to Amsterdam. I like imagined like what my dream life was abroad, and I was imagining like Netherlands. And now I'm here, which is really amazing.
Mhm.
But visualization can also help the brain like not feel so stressed about something. So for example, if you use a visualization of like, okay, like I'm going to the grocery store and I'm walking through the grocery store. This is a technique people with social anxiety can use, right? Like if you visualize yourself doing something, your brain will feel less scared to do it. So I tell people like visualize yourself just like sitting down and writing for 5 minutes and it feeling kind of scary at first and you pushing through that resistance and getting uncomfortable until it feels easier.
Mhm. Is there, do you find that there's like one main cause that you see a lot for writer's block, or is it just sort of all over the board, or what is that? I'm interested in what that looks like from your
Yeah,
side of things.
it's a lot of things. One of the main things I hear is the education system, trauma
Mm.
with the education system. So for example, like the red pen in school, right? Like we're not really taught to write without editing in school. And so a lot of times people with perfectionism issues
Mhm.
just can't get themselves to just like write a draft through. They end up just getting stuck in a revision trap and they rewrite their first, 20, 50 pages of their manuscript over and over. A lot of times it has to do with trauma from childhood, honestly. Sometimes a parent wasn't supportive of you being an author or being a writer. That happens a lot. And I think society, which is like such a cliche response, and it's kind of a depressing response, but that's just the reality. Like our society, especially in the US, is really not designed to be very supportive of writers and artists. Like it's just really not. And I mean, even when I was like in college, I would say like I'm an English literature major, and people would be like, "Well, what are you gonna do with your job? Like, how are you gonna make money?" Like it's just that's like the immediate response. I don't know if that's how it is in other countries, but in the US, that's how I experienced it.
Mm.
And I think a lot of people just conform as they get to be adults. Like I hear this story constantly where people are like, "Oh, I had no problem writing when I was a kid. I would just sit down and write, and it was easy and it was
Mm.
fun." And then I got into my teenage years, maybe a little bit later, maybe college, and it just all came crashing down. I hear that story constantly. And a lot of it is just that we stopped playing and having fun, and we
Mhm.
started making writing have to be this like thing. A lot of it comes back to growth mindset.
Mhm.
I see a lot of clients and students who have a very fixed mindset about things and really struggle to understand that like your first book, if not more like your first few books, are
Yeah.
probably going to be really messy and not very good, but that's the point. Like you
Mm.
don't come out of the womb knowing how to knit,
Mhm.
like
Mhm.
knowing how to like speak a million languages. You have to learn them and do it poorly for a while. Like you don't come out of the womb knowing how to walk. You have to walk and fall a lot and like do all
Mhm.
like trial and error in your life. And I think a lot of writers struggle with like letting things be messy because so much of their identity is all wrapped up in being a writer. I hear
Yeah.
like, oh, I just want to do my book justice. I hear that all the time. And I'm like, you won't do it justice the first time you write it.
Mhm.
You won't. That takes time. And you won't do your book justice as a newbie writer either.
It's interesting because that's making me think about, I talk to a lot of authors on the podcast, and oftentimes we talk about the distinction between, maybe I'm talking to a debut author, but most of the time people say, this is not the first novel I've written. This is the first novel that
Mm-hmm.
I've published.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a big difference between those two things.
It takes a lot of practice. A
Yeah.
lot,
Yeah.
as with anything in life.
What is, for somebody that is just bound up in that perfectionism, what's one of the first things that you sort of recommend for them to
Yeah.
get out of it?
I recommend rapid writing to people.
Oh,
So what
yeah.
rapid writing is something I learned from that book on writing on both sides of the brain.
Hmm.
And essentially what happens is you take a timer, right? Like you could take a timer or you could use your phone. I say timer only because like your phone has lots of distractions on it.
Yeah.
And you turn on the timer for 10 or 15 minutes and you write nonstop. And that means that you might say, I don't know what the hell to write. This is stupid. I hate this assignment. I don't know what to say. And that you just have to like keep your hand moving and you don't let your hand stop moving. And the reason for this is because it starts helping the perfectionism fall away a bit. It can take probably like a few times to actually make it feel helpful. But I always recommend that first because it just makes you realize, like, oh, this is fun. I
Mhm.
can write anything I want, right? Sometimes with perfectionism, and I've struggled a lot with this as well, we are very like treat our work as if it's like, oh, I don't want to kill my darlings, right? Like it's very precious to us.
Mhm.
And the reality is that you have to learn to kind of let go of that preciousness and just write some fucking crap. Sorry, I can
Yeah.
repeat that without saying cussing. I
Nope,
tend
it's
to cuss.
totally fine.
But yeah, I mean, you have to just write some crap and like be okay with that. I mean, I don't know how many times I've like rewritten my first novel, like because it was not good the first time I wrote it, and that's okay, right? Um, I think it takes a lot of time for perfectionism to loosen its grip for a lot of people. That's something I have noticed is like the procrastination slightly gets a bit easier with like the training of the brain, but
Mm,
perfectionism is a bit trickier.
yeah.
And usually that comes with a lot of just like letting yourself write something doesn't feel precious. I sometimes tell people to write a story that they don't have a lot of passion for, which sounds really ironic because people are like, oh, I want to write something that I'm passionate about.
Uh-huh.
If you don't care about it, you're not going to care about it and you're just going to be able to write it without really worrying what it sounds like. It'll
Yeah.
be easier to write.
What a great point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it seems very counterintuitive, but that totally makes sense. And I personally love the rapid writing. I almost find I mean, even if I have like a block of time when I can write and when I'm writing, I'll set the clock for 20 minutes just to like get myself trained into
Yep.
just getting something down, then like take a minute and then it'll be another 20 minutes. And then,
Yep.
that's just, I think
Yes.
that's almost my little thing that I do,
That's
that's my
awesome.
ritual.
Yeah.
To
I think
really
that's a lot of
do the
people's
thing.
rituals. It's really good. It's like brain dumping sometimes people call it,
Mhm.
or sometimes people call it morning pages, like Julia Cameron's
Oh,
morning
yeah.
pages. Yeah.
Mhm. The procrastination, there can be crippling procrastination, which, we've sort of been talking about. But in general, it is so widespread with writers across the board. I mean, even people who are like publishing and producing, like
Yeah.
it feels like, it's the old thing. I'm always talking with people about it, or like seeing people posting about, oh, I've got a deadline. And so my house has never been cleaner and my drawers have never been more organized. And why do we do that?
The brain, man, that's how the brain's designed. Ultimately, our brains don't give a shit about our goals. Okay. Our
Mm,
brain does not care whatsoever about our writing goals and our, workout goals, whatever goals we have in life.
Mhm.
All our brain cares about is that we are breathing. So, obviously I'm grateful that our bodies have, like evolutionized to be like this because we still exist as a species. But because of that, our modern brains haven't really changed with modern
Mhm.
life, right? So
Mhm.
it's triggered with things that are very simple, like, oh gosh, I have to write an email today, and your brain goes into like fight or flight when you try to write an email, or like when you do very simple things. And the reality is, like, this isn't going to change anytime soon. Like, you just have to use some of the like overall habit structures that can help. I think most people, not just writers, but like most people struggle with resistance because your brain is designed to conserve energy, right? Like when Britt Frank talks about this in her book, when you scroll TikTok for 4 hours, it's not because you're being lazy. It's
Mm.
because your brain thinks it has to conserve energy for the next time you might be in danger, right? Like your brain is literally always motivated to do something, whether that's survive when it's being attacked by a cheetah or conserve energy. That's it.
You're making me feel better.
Good. That's my job.
What's your personal writing routine like?
Yeah. So it's funny. I used to write every day. I had a writing streak for 1,500 days, and I broke it when I moved abroad. I broke it in February, and I didn't feel ashamed of myself, actually. I was like, you know what? I just moved abroad. I talk a lot about self-compassion in my programs because I'm a big proponent of it. And like the reality is that life is life, and we're not robots, right? My routine when I'm consistently writing is it's not really a routine at all. I think a lot of ADHDers probably relate to this, but I tend to show up. My body is a bit moody, right? So sometimes I will have days when like I can show up for a more consistent amount of time, right? They're like, oh, I'm like, oh, I don't have any meetings today. Like I can kind of use this amount of time to write and it's easy. And there are some days when my brain just doesn't really want to listen and I have to be a bit more gentle with myself.
Mm.
My routine when things are going well is I'll show up um, for 15-minute sprints and I give myself a sticker for every 15 minutes. And this is a really helpful way to brain hack. Stickers don't just work for kindergartners, you guys. It works for everybody. It gives you actually a really lovely dopamine hit and gives you proof of work. So for example, let's say like you sit down to write and you write for 15 minutes and you're like, oh, I get a sticker. And then like, you're like, well, I want to get like 5 stickers today. So like you're going to want to keep writing to get those stickers. So I give myself a sticker for each 15 minutes. My bare minimum usually is 15 minutes. So I give myself a sticker for that. And then if I can go longer, I try to go, for another 15 minutes, probably another 4 times. If that's like the goal usually. Um, if I'm in a time where I'm taking some time off from work, so for example, during the holidays,
Mm.
it can be a bit faster. I can write for a little bit longer during the day. But because I have my coaching business, things aren't very consistent in the sense of like, I can't do the same thing every day. My day looks very different every day, but I try to still show up twice, 3 times a week. That's usually the routine.
Right.
Yeah.
What book do you recommend the most?
Mm-hmm. I can show it to you. Let me grab it under, I have it propping up my computer ever since I moved. I haven't gotten my new stuff yet. This is the book I recommend. Around the Writer's Block, Using Brain Science to Solve a Writer's Resistance.
Mm.
So this is by Roseanne Bain. And I think she has a website that's really cute. It's called like The Bane of Your Existence or something like that, or The Bane of Your Resistance or something.
Oh, that's cute.
It is really cute. That's the book I recommend. It's a bit longer, and I think it can be a little bit dry if you're not like really into science, but it's very helpful. It goes into a lot of detail about the science behind why we resist writing. I also like constantly recommend The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron. That book changed my life. And it will always like hold a really special place in my heart.
Traditional last question on the podcast focuses on music, actually.
Oh,
So, if you had to pick a theme song for your work, Do you know what that might be?
Hmm. This is so funny. I don't remember the name of the song. I'm one of those weird people that doesn't do names of bands or songs. I just like forget the names of them. I'm like, what was that again?
I don't think it's weird at
I can
all.
hear it in my head, but I can't remember the name of it. Okay, let me find my playlist. It's funny because while I love music, I tend to need more silence when I write, or I like to have instrumental.
Mhm.
Let me, oh my gosh, my writing playlist. So like when you say your song, you mean like for my writing itself or for my coaching and my work in general?
It could be either one.
Oh man, man.
To make things easier for you, it can be.
That's so funny. Okay. I feel like, hmm, I'm gonna have to say, okay, for some reason, I'm looking through my playlist right now and I'm like, which one of these do I listen to constantly? So right now, I'm one of those people, and I feel like a lot of other neurodiverse people can relate to this. I listen to the same song on repeat for hours, which some people are like, what? Like, how do you do that? And then I have my like neurodiverse friends who are like, yep, that's what I do for weeks. And then I'm like sick of it for the rest of my life. Right now I'm listening to September. Um, it's by Aoni. It's a very like sad song, but I like the way it sounds. And I wouldn't say that it's like the song that my work like the sadness is what my work relates to. It's more just like the feeling that you get when you're listening to the song. And that's what I always think about in music. It's like the feeling you get when you're listening to it.
I love that.
Yeah.
How can people find you if they want to work with you for coaching?
Yeah. So all my links are on monicahay.com. So MONICAHAY.com. I'm on Instagram at Monica Hay Author. You can just send me a DM or you can just email me through my website.
Awesome. Monica, this has been so great. Thank you so much for joining. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, thank you, Kelley, for having me.
Thanks for joining us on Literary Prospects. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe and leave us a review. We'll see you next time.